Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. That's going to take us to key concept 3.2, the administration of empires in the period between 1450 and 1750. So, first of all, empires recruited and used bureaucratic elites as well as the development of military professionals, which became more common among rulers who wanted to maintain centralized control over their populations and resources. We already saw in Key Concept 3.1 that the Safavids used slave soldiers in order to expand their territory and their rule, as well as creating them as bureaucrats. The same thing happened in the Ottoman Empire. In the Ottoman Empire, this happened in a system that's called the Devshirme. Devshirme literally translates across as selection in Turkish. What the Ottoman Turks would do is they would go through usually Greek Christian communities, and they would require them to hand over a quota of young boys that were selected in this system that would be taught Turkish and forcibly converted to Islam. They would raise to be bureaucrats or soldiers. These soldiers were called janissaries, and they were used by the state to support the Sultan. They ended up becoming very loyal to the Sultan, and they were very early adopters of firearms. And so, in particular, gunpowder became an essential feature of Ottoman expansion. The Janissary soldiers look kind of like this. In Japan, they also used salaried samurai to help administer the state. They were, during the Tokugawa shogunate, members of the court, bureaucrats, and administrators, but they were also very, at least in theory, warriors, right? Because they were paid salaries, they were actually a lower rank in the social order because of Confucianism. Rulers continued to use religious ideas, art, and monumental architecture to legitimize their rule. This is largely a continuity throughout almost all of human history. It can be seen first by the Mexica in the Aztec Empire before the Spanish conquest. The Mexica widely practiced human sacrifice. They believed that that would maintain economic and social stability. It occurred throughout the year, not only by the government, but also by different tradesmen. Historians argue about its purpose. Was it to coerce obedience to the state? Was it to bring more power to priests and elites? We actually had quite a lot of writing that was produced in the Aztec Empire. The writing looks kind of like this. It's very complex. It hadn't been simplified by the time of the Spanish conquest. They created codices, but regrettably, King Itzcoatl burned all those books that did not legitimize the Mexica's ascent to power. The Spaniards were infamous for destroying books. Bishop Juan Zumarraga threw thousands of the Texcocan books onto the fire. And so there's not a ton of this writing that has survived, although there is some, and you can see it if you go see an Aztec, conference or something like that. The Europeans also used religious ideas to rule over their populations, in particular by this notion of divine right. Divine right can mostly be traced back to Charlemagne, who was crowned by the Pope in the year 800, and it brings about this idea that the European monarchs needed to have the Pope approve of their rule over their populations. And as such, they believed that they had the right and authority to rule over their populations by God. And so there was no legitimate idea in this system that the king's power could be checked by any other earthly agent. It reached its height under the rule of this guy here, Louis XIV, who believed that he could rule with absolute divine right over the population based on religion. The Qing Empire also had art that helped to legitimize their rule. This can be seen in particular with the imperial portraits that adorned the palace of the Forbidden City. They were placed in public areas to legitimize the rule of the emperors. This can be seen with this emperor, Kangxi, who's seen with a book which symbolizes a Confucian trait, scholarship. Art was not alone. It was also monumental architecture that helped to justify rulers' divine right or their right to rule over the population. This can be seen in the Incan Empire before the Spanish conquest, also with the Sun Temple of Cuzco that you can see here. In the Mughal Empire, they built up mausoleum or mosques, for example, the Taj Mahal that you can see here, one of the most gorgeous buildings ever built. And in Europe, there was the Palace of Versailles, built up by Louis XIV. In the Songhai Empire, the emperors adopted Islam to help to justify their rule. Rulers used tribute collection, they taxed farming, and they used innovative tax collection systems to generate revenue in order to forward state power and expansion. The zamindars in the Mughal Empire were intermediaries, for instance, between the rulers and the ruled. They were aristocrats. They collected taxes from the peasants, but kept 10% for themselves, paid in the form of crops like rice or pepper. But increasingly, the zamindars kept more and more of the taxes for themselves, which led to Emperor Akbar reforming the system. Peasants were to take crops to state-controlled markets to sell for cash, and so that took away a lot of the power of the zamindars. In the Ottoman Empire, they taxed farming through a system called the iltizam, which included the taxing of land, urban taxes, taxes of certain goods like wine or salt or senna that were produced. And in the Mexica Empire, they kept tribute lists. Tribute was collected based upon how close they were to the capital city, either every 80 days, 6 months, or 12 months, depending on how far they had to travel. Regions that failed to pay the tribute were very severely punished, but, they taxed, for instance, warrior costumes, shields, tropical feathers, copal, incense, animal products, foodstuffs, paper. Official tribute collectors known as Kalpixke were in each of the conquered provinces and ensured that payments were made as required. Researchers have observed that tribute payments were generally reasonable, and they were only increased if a region didn't keep up with its tribute obligations. In the Ming Dynasty, they collected taxes in hard currency. After the Mongol rule of China, there was disastrous inflation. The Mongols did not understand supply and demand and inflation, and so they made way too many of the paper bills that the Chinese had used before. And so the Ming Empire ended up dictating that all taxes had to be paid with silver currency. This massively spiked global demand for silver, which eventually made China the silver drain in the world economy of the early modern era, which is why silver production in the Spanish Empire in the Americas, for example, ended up being such a big deal for world history. Ladies and gentlemen, that's Key Concept 3.2.